CJ, welcome. We've got you in the sort of fireside chat position, so it's looking
Okay,
good.
great.
Yeah.
So it's not just my face that's dominating the whole screen, I hope. So
No. Peter's on here on stage. It almost looks like you're in cover. Yeah, we should put a chair underneath, so it looks like that.
I think that.
Okay, I think our hallway contingent is coming inside. I'm going to kick off our fireside chat. I'm Sarah Labowitz. I'm a colleague of Noah and Milo and the team here at Carnegie that's put together this task force over the last year. And it's my pleasure to introduce CJ Mahoney and Peter Harrell for the fireside chat, or what will be a Zoom side chat, I guess. And CJ and Peter have a set of intertwining experiences at the intersection of trade, international economics, and technology. And I know that they're going to have a rich conversation that gives us perspective from the two most recent presidential administrations. They were also major contributors to the task force's work, and they deserve a lot of credit for shaping the group's thinking on climate and trade. They also co-authored a fantastic report on the future of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA, which I commend to you all. You should read it. And so let me introduce them. Chronologically, I'll start with you, CJ. CJ served as President Trump's Deputy U.S. Trade Representative from 2018 to 2020. While at USTR, CJ led negotiations on the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement and helped shepherd the agreement through Congress, where it passed with the largest margin of any trade agreement in more than 30 years. He oversaw USTR's digital trade portfolio and helped launch free trade agreement talks with the United Kingdom and Kenya. CJ is now Microsoft's Deputy General Counsel for U.S. International Trade and International Trade and National Security. I should note he is speaking today in his personal capacity. Turning to Peter, he served in President Biden's White House from 2021 to 2022 as Senior Director for International Economics, where he was jointly appointed to the National Security Council and the National Economic Council. He co-led President Biden's supply chain resilience agenda, worked on global digital, 5G, and telecommunications strategies, spearheaded negotiations with the European Union on the US-EU data privacy framework, and worked on US sanctions and export controls in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Peter is now a non-resident scholar here at Carnegie in the American Statecraft Program, where he writes about trade policy, US economic competitiveness, and the use of economic tools, including tariffs, in US foreign policy. He's a lawyer in private practice advising companies on international strategy and risk. I should say that Peter regularly publishes in many prestigious places, but you should follow him on LinkedIn for his very current analysis of all things trade. So we're thrilled to have you for this fireside chat and to hear you talk about creative, ambitious ideas about trade and climate policy.
Great. Well, thank you, Sarah, for that warm introduction. And I'm sure CJ appreciates, although he's here in his personal capacity, the plug for LinkedIn, a Microsoft-owned property, though operating independently.
That wasn't paid for, but much appreciated.
So I have the unenviable task of a fireside chat with CJ, unenviable in two perspectives. First, CJ, we have the task of being the second panel, and there was already a fair amount of discussion on trade on the first panel, so I'm going to incorporate some of the discussion that came up there into the questions I'm going to ask you. I think it really reflects both the importance of the trade issue to the global clean energy transition, global clean energy future, obviously also the kind of current focus on trade here in Washington. Also unenviable because you're not here in DC, you are out in Seattle. It is a beautiful day here. I hope it is cold, gray, and rainy out there, and that you're suffering for not coming, but we do appreciate that you're here joining us virtually, and do understand, obviously, that you weren't able to come in person. So I guess I want to open, CJ, just by, with a fairly broad opening question for you. You know, I think one of the things we have seen over the last month is that President Trump has come into office with a very expansive trade agenda. You know, we see him making a variety of proposals around tariffs on a whole range of different countries. We see him actually having moved to impose tariffs in a couple of respects, with respect to China, coming into force in about a week and a half with respect to the steel and aluminum and derivative products. And we see him moving out across a couple of vectors with a very expansive set of trade policies, which I think shouldn't come as a surprise. He ran as a aggressive trade policy campaign, and I was aggressive on trade policy in his first term, so this shouldn't come as a surprise. But I'm interested in hearing from you, CJ, as someone who sat at USTR during Trump's first term, has thought a lot about trade policy, now has to work with trade implementation from a corporate perspective, although again, you're here in a personal capacity. If you were advising the Trump administration today, where would you see opportunities for the Trump administration to pick up some pro-climate, pro-green transition, or at least pro-all-of-the-above energy, maybe would be the way we'd want to phrase it, as he thinks about building out his trade policy, both over the next couple of months and then also over the next 2 years?
Well, thanks, Peter. It's actually, I don't know if you probably see the background. It's actually a rare sunny day in the Pacific Northwest in February. So I wish I could have been there with you in person, but the weather is not so bad this time of the year as it usually is. In terms of the opportunities, I think that they are in a couple of buckets, but you also have to put this in the agenda for this administration, which is obviously not going to be it's not going to be talked about as a climate or sustainability focused agenda. I do think, though, that there are some goals of this administration that overlap with the broader cause of clean energy and decarbonization. One is critical minerals. And there's a broad recognition that we need to have a more independent critical minerals supply chain. My view is that in order to bring some of that back to the US, or at least have another source, we should work with allies and partners to spread the cost of that around. So I'd say that that's one area. Another area is in autos, where a lot of the new construction of auto plants in the US that I would argue started during the USMCA negotiations, when it was clear we were going to have stricter content requirements, and then obviously continued into the Biden administration and was turbocharged with the IRA. A lot of that investment is in battery technology and in EVs. I also think that it's really important that policymakers see EVs in particular as not just a tool for decarbonization, but as an advanced technology. I just bought a Rivian. It's the best car I've ever owned. And I did not buy it for any virtue signaling purposes. I bought it because when I moved to Seattle, I just found myself driving a lot more, and it was just a real pain to have to stop at the gas station a couple times a week. So I think that both in terms of rules of origin as well as broader industrial policy on critical minerals, those are the kinds of things that you could work with trade partners on, either in using some of the traditional trade tools like rules of origin, or trying to have more of a common industrial policy on these issues.
Well, so let me actually dig in on one of those topics you put on the table around critical minerals, because I think we are seeing the Trump administration obviously express an interest in critical mineral resilience. They may not be thinking about it, as you say, as a clean energy issue per se, but they certainly think about it as an industrial security issue and as a national security issue. And we've just yesterday saw President Trump and Secretary Lutnick, for example, announce a new what's called a 232 investigation into U.S. imports of copper, which is a process by which the Commerce Department will be investigating whether U.S. copper imports threaten to impair U.S. national security, and which at the end of it will unlock a range of tools to try to promote resilient sources of copper, both here in the United States and around the world. But as we see the administration digging into the critical minerals issue, whether it is looking at their 232 or whether it is they potentially get into USMCA renegotiations over the coming months, are there some specific areas that you think we should be using trade policy to promote resilience in critical minerals supply chains?
I think you can use trade agreements there's no reason why you can't, in a trade agreement, for example, with Canada and Mexico, have a section of it, and there could be different versions of it. The kind of light touch version would be a commitment to coordinate in this area. But I think you could even get more ambitious, and you could require that the parties need to each put up a certain amount of money to foster the development of critical minerals, mining, and processing. You'd have to figure out how to do that, and maybe it's something that they agree to do domestically, but then would become part of the broader North American supply chain. You can use tariffs as well, but the problem with using tariffs, though, is that in a lot of these areas where there's nothing to start with, if all you're using is tariffs, I think it's going to be very difficult to be successful. And to the extent that you were successful, there would just be a lot of pain that would have to be endured until you could build a critical minerals processing facility. And there are some things that we have, like steel is a good example of an area where tariffs work really well in the steel industry, because we have a lot of excess steel capacity in the US. So whenever you put a tariff on steel, all of our steel manufacturers can hire another shift of workers, boost output, and in time, the output increases and prices normalize to where it's a little higher than the pre-tariff price, but you get essentially what you want, which is more domestic manufacturing, and without much of a price effect, and it can all be done very quickly. I mean, literally just like more or less overnight. In some of these areas where the supply chain just doesn't exist in North America, there might be a tariff component to it, but I think the tariff component would probably be the most successful if you phased it in after you had built some of these facilities. And the incentives to build the facilities would have to be, I think, something other than the promise of tariffs in the out years. Have to be financing or subsidies or something like that. And I don't know that there are probably some examples of countries doing some of these things, having cross-border industrial policies. Most of them are probably in the defense space. But I think that those sorts of things could be incorporated into trade agreements.
The other areas or another area, I should say, CJ, is I have been thinking about potential areas for trade agreements to foster cooperation in ways that would promote U.S. energy security, including in clean energy, would be trying to use trade agreements to get some joint cooperation on China. So one of the things that came out, in the task force's report, and that there was a briefing on at the beginning of the presentations today, in which I think many people have sort of read over the last couple of years, is that China has a very disproportionately large share of the productive capacity of a couple of clean energy technologies, solar obviously being one of them, various sorts of metals being another one, right, where is a high Chinese dominance. And it has struck me that at least conceptually you could envision trade agreements with American allies as providing a vehicle to get some of our allies to raise some of their own barriers to trade with China in a variety of products where there's an overcapacity out of China, including some of these clean energy type products, which would have the effect of both kind of insulating American allies from some of the competition they're facing from China. Also, I think would probably directly benefit many American firms, because the reality is if you're building an EV here in the United States and you want to export that to Europe or to Japan, among the other challenges you're going to face is if there's a very cheap Chinese EV in that European or Japanese market, it's going to be very hard to compete in that market to export your car to. I'm interested, based on your experience as a trade negotiator and the thinking you've done since, how realistic do you think it would be for the Trump administration to try to use some of the trade deals they seem interested in striking around the world to encourage countries to raise some of their own barriers to China? And how would you recommend the administration potentially think about that in ways that would help foster an American all of the above energy manufacturing and export strategy?
I think it's a really interesting topic, and I think the bottom line is I think there's a good chance for that. I think that the Europeans, the Canadians, the Mexicans are all interested right now in having that conversation, and it's such a big shift from where we were 8 years ago. It would have been very hard to have had a conversation at that point about the U.S. asking another country to raise its trade barriers. Now, you all in the Biden administration had, I think, there were some really great ideas when you were working on the Global Steel Pact to do something like that. And it's interesting, but it is a challenge for trade negotiators, particularly in some other countries, to get their head around, because for the last 70 years, trade agreements were about reducing barriers to trade. But now what we're talking about is essentially creating artificial markets that have walls where the trade agreement, and if to the extent that the walls are reinforced by trade agreements, the trade agreements would be creating those barriers. But I do think that it's in the world in which we live, a lot of times the question of what tariffs do you have against me is really less important than what tariffs do you have against somebody else, and China being the most important one right now. I would argue that the 301 tariffs that the first Trump administration put on China did more to increase U.S. trade with Vietnam and Malaysia and other countries in Southeast Asia than TPP ever would have. And the other thing, just another point I would make, though, is I think to some extent, we're kind of headed in this direction anyway. You've seen Europe, Canada, Mexico all put tariffs on Chinese EVs in the past year. So I think there's definitely room to have that kind of a conversation about how do we have our own market where we're going to have our own, and maybe there won't be maybe it won't be completely tariff-free even within the market, but there would be one set of rules for people who are inside, another set of rules for people who are on the outside, and the rules for the insiders would be more favorable.
It's interesting you make that point on the 301 tariffs on China, the pull that had for Vietnam, for some of the other U.S. partners. Mexico too, I think, has been a big winner there. You compare it to TPP, and I have to say, I maybe a couple of months ago did the historical research on this, and it's certainly true as an analytic basis that the Commerce Department's kind of official report on TPP's impacts, which was published in early 2015. If you just look at the expected trade flows had we had TPP from a number of the TPP members, and you compare that to what in fact we have today, actually the actual trade flows with most TPP members are well above what they were projected to be in the Commerce Department study. So I think you have to be onto something, that the tariffs on China were a great push for friendshoring. Another area I want to ask you about, which I think can be a little bit more complicated because of both security concerns, also, frankly, just kind of jurisdiction, U.S. government jurisdictional issues, both with congressional committees and with different parts of the government. But another area that has struck me would be ripe for deal making here in a way that could advantage a couple of particular types of U.S. Clean energy, and in particular nuclear, would be to try to better integrate certain export control measures with trade agreements. One of the barriers, if you talk to guys, whether it's sort of traditional U.S. nuclear companies or some of the folks in the small modular space, it's a heavily regulated, heavily export-controlled industry for very understandable reasons. We're all worried about nuclear security. We're all worried about proliferation. On the other hand, it seems to me from a trade policy perspective, if we could facilitate some of those exports, it would be positive for U.S. industry and also positive for global clean energy goals. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about whether you think there would be some ways to use trade negotiations to, figure out how to create maybe, some more allied export control blocks on a couple of these key green energy technologies.
I think there's definitely an opportunity to do that. What it would require, though, is a level of cooperation between the agencies and the relevant agencies in the U.S. government, which traditionally in trade negotiations, there's been a role for some of the other agencies, but USTR has been in the driver's seat on the export control front. Especially in the Biden administration, there was a lot of negotiation with allies about having reciprocal controls. And some of those, I mean, my sense was that was mostly led by the NSC and the Commerce Department, as opposed, and that USTR was not a player in that. I think one interesting thing about this administration, in terms of how they're setting it up, though, is the relationship between USTR and Commerce. Jamison Greer and Howard Lutnick, I believe, are going to work very, very closely together as a team. And I think that they will be a very good complementary team. Because they have different areas of expertise, and so I think if two people could, if you're ever going to have a Commerce Secretary in the USTR that could figure out a way to incorporate some of the commerce tools into a USTR-led trade agreement, I think this administration offers an opportunity to that, assuming that we're going to be doing trade negotiations.
Do you think we will be doing trade negotiations? I guess that's you put it on the table.
I think we'll be doing trade negotiations. What exactly the ultimate strategy and the policy is unclear right now, and I think that to some extent that's kind of the point. I think that as a negotiating tactic, and it's not a bad negotiating tactic in a lot of instances, is to be somewhat opaque about what your goals are. At some point, it's important to get more crisp about that. And I do think from the perspective, when you're thinking about moving supply chains, I do think that predictability and signaling is important. Because in some ways, if what we're trying to do is move supply chains, you're not just negotiating with the foreign governments, you're negotiating with the private sector. And the lead time to move things and source components from different areas is long. So I hope that we get over this initial phase of unpredictability. Again, I have maybe some more tolerance and show some more grace towards it, given it is very early in the administration. Would not be unsurprising as a negotiating tactic, but I really think that there are tons of opportunities, and I expect that the president is going to want some deals, and that Jamison and Secretary Lutnick will be able to, or Ambassador Greer and Secretary Lutnick will be able to serve up some pretty compelling deals.
So I want to invite in just a moment members of the audience, whether online or here in the room, to ask a couple of questions. But I do have one or two final questions for you, CJ, before I open it up. One of which is, I think as we here at Carnegie try to think about trade and climate issues, obviously a lot of our work is US focused, but we also try to think about the global perspective on this set of issues. And if I think kind of outside of Washington, irrespective of what is going on here, we do see a number of other countries moving forward with trade and climate agendas. European Union, for example, seems to be moving forward with its CBAM. There are more hit or miss efforts in Canada and elsewhere to move forward with carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And, we see a variety of countries around the world trying to foster, investment and use investment and trade tools to foster their own green ambitions. Let me focus on, ask you questions a little bit Europe specific, but you could also generalize a little bit more. If you were in Brussels, moving forward with your own climate and trade agenda, how would you advise that government to think about ways of docking that with what's going on here in the United States? In a different administration, I think there would have been a lot of talk about, joint cooperation on CBAMs, and it's not that nothing is happening here. Obviously, earlier today on the previous panel, we heard some about, the polluter import fee proposal that's continuing to be developed in Congress. So it's not that nothing's going on here, but it does seem we are probably on a slower burn with respect to those kind of measures than many other, or at least a number of other countries would be. So if you were thinking about that, you have these things going on with a couple of America's big trading partners. How would you be thinking about those potentially docking with what's going on here in Washington?
I think I've always thought that this CBAM, that CBAM could lead to some interesting trade negotiations with the U.S. And what you guys were trying to do, Peter, with the global steel arrangement, was an example of that, where trade barriers were going to be created, but they were going to be created for common trade barriers for the U.S. and Europe were going to be created, but they were going to be justified by decarbonization and climate sustainability goals, as opposed to protectionism. That always struck me as a way of achieving what the U.S. wanted to achieve, and including the Trump administration wanted to achieve in the steel sector, but doing it in a way that was more palatable to European sensibilities, arguably more compatible with the rules of the WTO. So, I mean, I guess the advice that I would have for the Europeans is that if they want to go in this direction, to really just focus on what is the end state that you want to get to, and then just have an honest conversation about, you guys can talk about it one way for your own domestic political audience, and we can talk about it another way. But the importance is that we're aligned on what the outcome can be.
All right, well, let me open it up. I'm sure we have some questions in the room and online. Yeah, over here. And can we get a mic just so that CJ can hear?
Yeah. Thank you so much for the discussion. My name is Crystal Hiltebrand. I'm the Director of International Policy at Third Way. Really interested in the conversation on transatlantic relationships and specifically Europe. And I'm wondering if you could touch a little bit on the role that sectoral trade agreements can play for specific technologies or goods in the clean energy space in the absence of free trade agreements or like more comprehensive trade agreements. And I'm thinking in terms of bilateral cooperation with like either specific member states or the UK, for example, and how, agreements like that could foster secure, reliable supply chains, including third countries, for these specific sectors, goods or technologies.
CJ, you want to start?
Sure. The bottom line is I think that there's a big role for sectoral agreements. I don't think we're going to do big, comprehensive USMCA, TPP kinds of agreements, at least in the near term. It's these agreements just get so big. A lot of times, if you look at like what's in a U.S. trade agreement, a lot of it doesn't have to do really with topics that are relevant to the particular country we're doing the agreement with. A lot of it is language that is there to set precedent at some maybe good public policy, always has some interest group that feels very strongly about it. But then what that means is that you have these proxy battles over things that don't really matter a lot. And I mean, a good example was some of the pharmaceutical and IP provisions that we've had in these agreements, which I think IP provisions in trade agreements are a good idea. I think it's ultimately good for the U.S. economy. But sometimes you get then into that gets you mired in the domestic politics of drug prices. And so the sectoral agreements, the thing I like about the sectoral agreements just from a political standpoint is that you can pick and choose your battles and not have to fight all of them at one time. The question is in clean energy of what would be the deals that you can have. And I do think some things like a battery technology, we talked about critical minerals. You could see those kinds of agreements. The difficulty you're going to have with Europe, though, is their sustained piety regarding the WTO rules. And somebody who was locked horns with the Europeans on these issues, I would argue that they're not as biased as they profess to be. But that's always a subject of conversation. And the EU is always going to be the provision of the WTO rules that allows you to have more that allows an exception to the MFN standard requires that you have agreements that cover substantially all trade. So I think it's a good idea, but at least with Europe, those kinds of things will be complicated to the extent that you're dealing with trade and tariffs and real levers that allow you to move supply chains as opposed to just cooperation and standards and those kinds of things.
Maybe I'll add just a thought or two onto that. I mean, I remember I was on a public panel, so I'm not violating a Chatham House rule, with Jameson probably last summer, early fall. It was pre-election, and he got a version of this question, sort of, what do you think about sectoral agreements? And his basic answer was, well, if you exclude the USMCA agreement, which CJ, you obviously were instrumental with, but which was also kind of a rewrite, a major rewrite, but an update and rewrite of an existing agreement. If you exclude that, we haven't really done a comprehensive trade agreement in more than a decade. And that, in his view too, maybe a sectoral approach is a way that we could get some movement on actual trade agreements while avoiding, similar, CJ, to your point of view, avoiding some of the domestic political issues that just seem to be becoming intractable to the closing of comprehensive agreements. If I was thinking about a energy sectoral agreement in the current administration, from where I sit as somebody who served in the previous administration, I guess I would think there probably is some opportunity, but I would think that with this administration, you'd have to frame it as an energy sector part of agreement. And we know for a fact, because Trump has talked about it, that he's interested in selling more LNG and American hydrocarbons to Europe and to several other countries around the world. I do sometimes wonder, as we see all these delegations come and promise to buy more U.S. LNG, I feel like we might be selling the same LNG 3 or 4 times at this point. But maybe production will expand and it will work. But I actually think the important thing for the Trump administration is to emphasize, yes, we have an energy sector agreement that will include hydrocarbons, but should also give some credit and have some real meaningful provisions around an all-of-the-above energy strategy. It will also have important elements around minerals security and mineral supply chains. It will also have important elements around some of the clean energy infrastructure. And I think here, actually, come back to a point we were talking about, and I'd put on the table earlier, and that CJ had talked about. Here, it would also be valuable to have some joint cooperation in clean energy technologies against China. So if I think about an energy agreement, let's suppose autos fit in that. We know Trump cares about autos. If I want to sell more U.S. electric vehicles in Europe, I'd obviously love Europe to reduce its current 10% tariff on American autos to 2.5%. But if Europe, because of its adherence to WTO rules, also reduces its tariffs on Chinese autos to 2.5%, from a very kind of mercantilist perspective, that's not going to do much for U.S. auto manufacturing, because they're just going to be outcompeted by their Chinese competitors, heavily subsidized in Europe. So I think that would be another area. Let's talk about it as an energy sector, and let's put different pieces together for it. And see if that's something that maybe the administration would be willing to pick up on. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm Bella Tonkanogi with Climate Policy Initiative and previously Senior Advisor to Secretary Yellen on climate, including on trade issues. One thing that was brought up in the previous panel was around consistency, credibility, and trust, and the importance of those issues. And I'm curious, we see, for example, in Canada that there's kind of a nascent Buy Canadian movement. Mexico's not very happy with us. Does that matter? Or is American market power enough? Do we need to be working, how is this going to play out? And I'm just curious, from your experience in the previous administration, how important is that, more the soft power versus our hard market power?
I think over the long run, consistency, credibility, trust, those are really important. It's important that we be seen as a reliable partner and a reliable supplier. That said, you can have moments of tension. And just going back to my experience in the USMCA negotiations, there were some low moments. We had a moment in, I think it was in June of 2018, when there was a G7 summit in Charlevoix in Quebec, and Trump and Trudeau, I think Trudeau gave a closing press conference after Trump had left and said some provocative things about Trump. Trump was then on Air Force One, I think maybe going to Asia, and then just unleashed a tweet storm against Trudeau. This was in the middle of the negotiations, and we basically didn't talk to the Canadians for another 6 weeks. We found a way out of that. So I think that I don't think that anything that has happened so far in the administration, and obviously Munich and with Mexico and Canada, feathers have been ruffled. What I hope though is that this is this is a prelude to a reconciliation and a deal. That's a very glass half full kind of perspective. But I mean, that's all to say that I agree that being a reliable partner is really important, but that's not necessarily inconsistent with having some periods where you're fighting with your partner, particularly over issues where you want to move your partner to an endpoint that ultimately could be in everyone's mutual interest.
Just to add, I mean, the Biden administration obviously rhetorically and in substance on issues like Ukraine, very pro-European, right? Very strong transatlantic president. Rhetorically, that said, the Europeans were really pissed at the IRA, right? They felt they felt very singled out. They felt attacked. There were 6 or 8 weeks where you basically, you probably remember this too, you couldn't meet with a European official without them going through this obligatory, you are persecuting our clean energy industry set of talking points. I mean, that was not easy either. I do think obviously Biden administration got through that. And indeed, one of the ways they got through that was by getting Europe to say, maybe we should be doing some more investment in clean energy here in Europe to kind of compensate for this. So I actually agree with CJ. My take talking to foreign governments, there's a lot of distress in Europe about the Munich speech right now. But on the trade front, by and large, most of our trading partners, at least at a governmental level, well, they are quite concerned. And I think that if they actually get hit by 10 or 20% tariffs for months or years, that's going to be quite hard to overcome. But at least so far, there's also a sense of, well, there is a deal-making element to this. I mean, Trump had threatened, CJ, as you remember, he threatened 5 or 10% tariffs on Mexico, starting shortly at one point during the USMCA negotiations. I mean, there's sort of a sense of, well, we've been through this before. Let's see what actually happens. Obviously, if he imposes tariffs on us, we'll retaliate, and they're thinking all that through. But I guess I agree with CJ that we're probably still in a position where it will be, able to kind of come together and get past this. I do think that might change if we're in a world where, for a year or two, some of our allies actually face, major tariffs kind of across the board.
I just wanted to add, I completely agree with that, Peter. And just one other point I wanted to make is that, well, again, if you do these kinds of things too often, at some point that causes real damage to a relationship, at least in the short term. The U.S. under the old rules of the old WTO style negotiations, the U.S. really got to a point where we didn't have a lot of leverage in trade negotiations because our market was wide open, our tariffs were low, and so if we wanted another country to do something, particularly if we wanted to do something that they didn't want to do or was in their interest, it was really hard. Some of these threats and this disruption do create some leverage. Again, I think you could overuse it, but I'm just going to choose to be an optimist and think that I think there's a chance that this could lead to, at the end of the day, some more cooperation. And in the case of North America, I hope that it leads to a quicker and more creative negotiation about the renewal of USMCA, which could ultimately result in a more integrated North American economy rather than one that's less integrated.
Yes, question over here.
Hi, hello, Fabian Villalobos from the RAND Corporation. I have a question about potential unintended consequences of trade policy and trade barriers. Say you do create this walled garden. There's a lot of talk. I've heard a lot of discussion about EU, Mexico, Canada. I haven't heard as much about Korea and Japan. I also haven't heard as much about how these trade barriers might affect developing countries that are trying to move up these value chains, and how Chinese overcapacity, if it hits a wall within the U.S. and EU, will be how it might be redirected into developing countries that are trying to achieve development of their own, and at the same time, depending on how you structure, which HS code you pick to actually block, right, might actually incentivize investment in the processing and midstream, right, outside of the United States, which is the thing we're lacking and we need to move into. So, question about unintended consequences. Yeah.
And then are there any other questions? Is there one last one, just because we are basically at time? Yeah, we'll take last question here, and then CJ, turn to you to answer them both and close us out.
Thank you both. I have two tiny questions. One is...
Oh, yeah, let's get it. Sorry.
First question is really building on Fabian's question. Just, you mentioned some creative trade tools, rules of origin, 301 coordination. What is it going to take from a trade policy perspective to, if we're just thinking about trade policy, to get more of the nascent processing, not like today's existing steel and aluminum smelters, but other critical minerals in the United States? And the second one is, do you guys think that this Greenland conversation is going to result in Greenland joining USMCA via the review?
I'll let you take Greenland, Peter.
Well, I'll let you take the rest, and I'll offer a view on Greenland.
Well, I mean, so starting with the point about unintended consequences, I think that those are all very, very good points, because what we are talking about is something that the government is not shown a lot of, historically has not shown a lot of competence in doing, and all of these things are legitimate. And certainly, one of the hard things about tariff barriers is that you have to kind of really go down the chain, because otherwise what you do, and to some extent this has happened with 301 tariffs with China. I mentioned the increased trade between the US, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Well, a lot of that is with Chinese companies that have set up assembly operations in those countries in order to avoid the tariffs, but they're shipping in a lot of the high value added components from China. I would still argue that even that is a step in supply chain diversification, but the point about how you can create unintended consequences. And then the question about diversion then of Chinese overcapacity to the global south, I think that's a real concern. I honestly don't know. I'm not sure exactly what you do about it, especially if from the perspective of if we think that the U.S. and our allies need to have independent manufacturing capacity, I'm not sure how I mean, maybe at some point, maybe you could have other arrangements with the global south. I mean, you might actually end up with a trading system where U.S. has one set of rules for its allies, one set of rules for adversaries, and then another set of rules for countries in the middle, with maybe perhaps even more generous, maybe a fourth set for developing countries.
I'll just add on to that. I have sort of two comments on, Fabian, your question around global south. First is, I do think that at least for sort of the next period of time, 5, 10, 15 years, the sort of export-oriented development model that was so successful for China, that has also been successful for a number of countries, whether it's Vietnam or whether it's Malaysia or Thailand or Mexico, that was sort of dependent on very liberal access to the U.S. and to a lesser extent other high-income Western markets. I think it's probably going to be a less successful development model for a number of those developing world countries going forward, because I think we have made here in the U.S. and in a number of the other high-income developed countries, we've made sort of a policy choice of we actually don't want to see further erosion of our own manufacturing. If anything, we'd like to rebuild it. And that is going to put some pressure on these countries, developing world countries, to think about other economic models to move up their own economic ladders. And I think the prior Biden administration's view on this was, well, what is going to happen here if we are importing less? We probably would friendshore some, and there's some benefit for these guys from diversification away from China. But where we are going to be importing less on net, you're going to need to provide greater financing tools for these countries to do kind of domestic types of investment that will give them an alternative way to move up the economic ladder. That was at least the theory of the case in the Biden administration. I'm not sure the Trump administration is going to do that. So I think it's going to force a little bit of a rethink for some of these countries on what is their economic model for development here, because I do take the point. And I see we are at time. On Greenland, I don't know. I mean, Trump's been serious about this for a long time, right? If you talk to people who served in his first term, like he was sort of serious about it then. He just didn't talk about it as much publicly. I think that a very long road to getting them to be a FTA country, they got their own sort of decisions about what they're going to vote for their relationship with Denmark and, this kind of thing. I could actually see a world where Greenland is sort of an FTA partner and also a security partner, but is not like annexed to the United States as being potentially a landing zone from this. But there's a lot of steps that would have to be taken to get there. CJ, thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you all. I guess I wasn't going to agree with you.
Thank you to both of you. I have two things to tell you. One is that there are fresh snacks, and so you should take a 5-minute break while we get ready for our next panel, which is going to be a great sort of take home with some of the biggest industry leaders in batteries, geothermal, and solar.
No, thank you. Hey.
I'm Lily Brumley. We're for Brian Hackett and my
Yes.
thank you for moderating that. And I always think very helpful in time gesturing and flagging. Everybody check it out. Yeah, he's busy. Yes, yes, of course. Always very productive. Wants to make an impact.
got a good crowd. I'm glad people are sticking this out.
Oh, that's good.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you are enjoying the afternoon coffee and treats. This is our last. Panel of the day, and I'm just so excited for the discussion we're going to have. We have three true industry leaders at the precipice of some of the most cutting-edge clean technologies in the United States right now. I want to just create some overview with saying that much of the task force work, and I think this came across pretty clearly on, at least by the second session, was about identifying where the U.S. has industrial strength. What does that actually mean? What does that look like? Earlier this year, I published a paper called Catching Up or Leaping Ahead, which outlines very specifically where the U.S. should focus efforts. And all of those efforts are not on incumbent technologies. They're all on next-generation systems. Lithium-sulfur batteries, perovskite solar cells, and enhanced and advanced geothermal systems, all of which we have here today to discuss. And the last thing I'll say is that it's an important story to highlight, because I think a lot of this conversation is about the scale of how far behind the United States is right now. This graphic that Noah presented on China's really widespread lead, we've all seen in various ways, we're all aware of. But there's this other story, and there's a caveat to that, there's nuance to that, and that's that the US has an exceptional arsenal of new technologies being incubated here with the potential to alter some of these industrial and geopolitical dynamics. I'm going to begin by introducing our panelists, Selena Mikołajczyk.
Yeah.
Chief, did I get it?
Yeah, you did.
Great. Chief Battery Technology at Lyten, the only company globally set to develop a commercial-scale lithium-sulfur battery. Selena is a leader in the U.S. battery ecosystem with decades of experience at the likes of Tesla, Panasonic, and more, holds a master's degree in mechanical engineering, and is just an exceptional voice on this subject. Selena, we're grateful to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Danielle Murfield, the Chief Technology Officer at Q-Cells, the only company capable of producing an entire polysilicon solar panel in the United States, with some important new developments underway on next-gen perovskite cells. Danielle spent decades at GE Renewables, where she was Chief Technology Officer. She holds a PhD in electrical engineering and is also a member of the Carnegie Taskforce. Danielle, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Last but not least, Lev Ring. Lev is the president at Sage Geosystems, an innovative new company using the subsurface to develop resilient and sustainable geothermal power and storage. Lev brings decades of experience from the oil and gas sector at Weatherford and Shell. Lev holds a PhD in applied physics and is a master at the subsurface. Lev, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Great. So just question one. For those not familiar with these technologies, can you tell us about what your company is developing? What are your primary projects, and what do these systems offer? Selena.
Sure. So at Lyten, we're doing lithium-sulfur batteries. So lithium-sulfur, very exotic chemistry, it sounds like. It's fire and brimstone, right? Lithium-ion, right? It's 30 years. It's fueled our transitions with laptops and cell phones and now cars. Great chemistry. I've worked in lithium-ion for about 20 years, okay? And I worked at Tesla. Yeah, I've worked for the guy before. 6 years. I worked at Panasonic. I shipped 2 billion cells to Tesla. So I've worked for that dude twice, okay? Great technology. It's evolved over 30 years substantially to make electric vehicles happen. There's a problem, though. That technology, to have the range that you need for your cars, that you desire for your cars, really requires nickel, okay? You can do LFP, and it's a cheaper alternative. It tends to be really heavy to get the range that you need. It's okay. It's not great, okay? So if you want a great electric car, you need a high nickel chemistry. So it's NMC or NCA. There's not that much nickel in the world, okay? And it requires some pretty heavy mining to get that nickel as it is. And if you look at the demand for electrification and you look at the amount of nickel in the world and how much is in production, you realize pretty quick that we ain't going to electrify everything with nickel chemistries because there's just not enough. Okay. So how do you look at that? What do you do next? Well, really lithium sulfur is that solution for how you electrify everything because the raw materials are very, very abundant, right? Sulfur is a byproduct for most extractive industries. So if you're producing oil, if you're doing coal, if you're doing other kind of mining, you're going to have sulfur as a byproduct. What you find is you have sulfur used for agricultural products, but it's super cheap because no one really has a lot to do with it. You'll find mountains of sulfur at ports, and you can see them from space, okay? They're yellow, right? And you'll see these at most ports. So sulfur is a very abundant, very cheap cathode material. You mix it with a carbon. We do our 3D graphene is our trade name for the carbon that we developed to hold on to the sulfur and give it a conductive backbone and make it work as a battery. The anode is lithium. It's lithium metal for sulfur. It's, a lot of people have been talking about lithium metal. It is the holy grail as opposed to a carbon which holds lithium ions. You do the anode in lithium metal. In sulfur, it works well because the sulfur suppresses dendritic growth, so you get a very safe cell. Comes with a lot of challenges, of course. It's a difficult chemistry to master. And people have been trying lithium sulfur cells since the 60s. It was kind of like, well, that's hard. It's interesting. It's hard. It gives you a great energy density. It's super cheap, but it's hard. So everyone focused on lithium ion, which was, a good move, right? But now when we look at, okay, we've gotten lithium ion to a point and we're running into the barriers of availability and cost, you say, okay, I can get to sulfur. That's how I ultimately make cars for everyone. That's how I ultimately supply the stationary storage business with all the move to AI and the increased power loads and requirements for that. If you're going to use renewables for that, you've got to have a battery system in there with that. And your stationary systems all use the same battery technologies that go into cars, okay? So if you want to have that big data storage, AI systems, and all that resiliency on your power grid, you need batteries for that as well as for cars. And then, all of the other needs that you have for batteries where people talk about like micromobility, and in a lot of the developing world, micromobility is really the way that you're going to move people, right? It's going to be 2 or 3 wheelers, not so much luxury sedans. All those areas, that's where lithium sulfur comes in because it's lower cost and it's got higher energy density, right? So a really great chemistry for the future. Hard to do, but huge upsides in, in a lot of different areas. So that's what lithium sulfur is about.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Danielle.
Thank you very much, Milo. So as you know, I work for Q-Cells, and what we are doing in the U.S. is focusing on solar. And I just want to give you a few points because solar has always been one of my favorite energy sources, but I want to make sure you understand why, and maybe it will become yours as well. Right now in the U.S., we only have about 5% of our energy, of our power comes from solar. It's expected by 2050 it could be 50%. And that might sound extreme, but the reason why there's this expectation that we're going to have such a larger dependence on solar is because it is already so inexpensive. It's easier to deploy, it's easier to permit because it can also be broken up into smaller distributed pieces, while it also could compete at industrial or utility scale. So it's got a lot of flexibility and agility in terms of its energy physical profile. It also has increasing value in terms of ability to couple it with batteries has given it a sort of a shot in the arm, a great surge, making it even more competitive, which it already sort of beats on cost, any other fully dispatchable or many dispatchable types of technologies. So solar isn't the solar we knew of even a decade ago. And it's easy for people who aren't in the space to remember what solar was, sort of limited, non-dispatchable. There's so many different framings for it. Sun doesn't always shine. No, these are kind of old tropes now in terms of how solar is impacting our energy community. So when you think about any country, but I'll focus on ours, right? Any country that will be looking to have such a dominant position of their own energy dependence on one type of technology, the core of that, the source of power conversion from sunlight to electricity, while it might be very commoditized, it even could continue to be commoditized, it's an important anchor that you want to control your own destiny. There's a belief that most countries would want not to be dependent on adversaries, rivals, or allies for that core bit. So the idea is, how do countries build that kind of capability or some interdependence with friendly partners? And what Qcells has done is bet on the fact that the US is going to want to control their own destiny, at least to some degree, and have invested about $3 billion in the last few years in building this end-to-end supply chain from ingot to wafer, cell, module, to be able to contribute, even though our all-in-one facility is just over 3 gigawatts. The US puts in much more than that, 50 gigawatts of power every year. But in the last year, this is maybe another little fun fact, this last year, 2024, 2/3 of the new power that was installed was solar. Year before that, it was over 50%, which was the first time any renewable had been over 50% for 80 years when hydro was growing. So it's already becoming dominant. It's only 5% now, but to get to 50% by 2050, which also, by the way, will have probably about a 40% load growth, it's just this wave of power that's going to be coming from a resource that we need to make sure we have more control of our destiny. So in terms of what our company is doing, we're building this sort of integrated capability to develop everything domestically. There's a lot of reasons besides owning our own destiny. There's a lot less risk from being able to source from other geopolitical concerns or climate concerns in terms of climate catastrophes or disasters, and also just risk. I mean, we also sell projects to customers. We would love to not have to have a risk factor in there about whether or not we can get these panels on time to where they go. The two other things that I will just add here in the intro about what Qcells is focused on is we know that going forward, there's going to be a need for the next generation of technology. I'll talk more about that later, but perovskites are a thin film material that is going to be transformative. Many people believe it. I wasn't a believer last year this time, but I am now because we've made some good progress ourselves. But it's widely believed to be sort of the trajectory of reduction in cost. We've already seen significant improvements in solar just in the last 10 years. Even just this year, 2024, we saw the expansion of the next generation of conventional silicon technology, which is about 20% more power dense than the one that came before it. The next step will be another 20 to 50% jump forward. So we're investing in that next stage because we want to have that root, that capability. And then the last piece, which many solar companies are doing independently of being a manufacturer, is we're also working on physical hardware and software systems so we can supply the complete system, not just the kernel that makes the first step of that power generation capability. And we do EPC, we do utility projects. We're developing a lot of software capabilities around virtual power plants. There's a lot of different power market rules across the US, so software can help us a lot in terms of extracting value from solar and solar plus storage at every turn. So it's kind of this broader story of building value from the kernel of the solar module, but I'm sure we'll get back to the module.
Looking forward to it. Thanks for that. The floor is yours.
Yeah, so new generation of geothermal. So you probably guys all know that geothermal usually associated with drilling for hot water or steam, producing in them, and depending on temperature, converting to electricity. 100-old technology, 17 gigawatts globally, which is nothing, like 0.4 or 1%. Why? Because you really need to live on a ring of fire, okay? Otherwise, you can drill, but nothing is going to flow on you. So in 60s, there was an idea developed by actually Department of Energy, one of the labs, why we cannot drill for temperature and then organize some kind of downhole heat exchanger, okay? And then we'll pump water through this heat exchanger and produce temperature and convert. So you don't depend on aquifers, you just need a hot rock. And that has a brand name like dry hot rock geothermal. Well, the recipe is simple, but implementation hasn't been very, very difficult, okay? So 4 years ago, with my partners, we are 30 years oil and gas veterans, looked at it and decided that we probably know how to do it. And so we started SAGE, and we are developing and commercializing actually 2 products. One is long duration energy storage, thanks to Daniel, with her implementation and fast growth of solar. Everybody needs long duration energy storage. And our geothermal storage built on the same platform. So we drill for wells, we create hydraulic fractures, also known as a fracking, and then we inflate these fractures with the water, okay? And then earth stresses try to close these fractures and produce water back. So in the case of storage, it's pump hydro upside down. Pump hydro, if you guys don't know, you're taking 2 lakes, one at the lower level, another at the higher level. You pump water when demand is lower for electricity from lower to upper, and then when you need electricity, you produce it back. We do just the same, but instead of pumping up, we pump into the fracture system. And so when demand is high, we open wellhead and we produce through the same Pelton turbine, and we convert to electricity, very high efficiency, it's pure mechanical system, no temperature involved. Now, if we need geothermal as a base power, you cannot generate power with this. You store, and then you, with roughly 70% round trip efficiency. Now, if you need to generate power, you do exactly the same, but now you drill to 200 C, okay? And if I take Texas, we know how to do it. It's called deep gas. We drill for these temperatures in oil and gas. So you drill, you create fractures. Now you need 2 wells, you operate them the same way, but it's kind of half and puff, or you can imagine 2-cylinder engines. One you pump in, another is producing, and then you reverse. And so we just finished construction of the first commercial storage facility. It's currently on a land owned by lignite coal power plant that's going to be decommissioned in 2 years. They're moving to Daniel's technology, but sun is not up 24/7, so that's going to be combined with our storage and with battery storage to deliver to the customer electricity 24/7. And then military funded a project in also South Texas to convert our test well to geothermal producer, and we just signed a big offtake agreement with Meta to supply geothermal power to their data centers.
Fantastic. All exciting developments. I want to start with you, Selena. The task force, as I mentioned, has been adamant about leapfrog technologies and their potential to bolster competitiveness. What would it look like if Lighten and companies like yourself are to unlock lithium sulfur technology? How would it benefit supply chain security in doing so?
Yeah, okay. So when you work in lithium ion, you realize you have got a huge supply chain, all right? And you make a battery factory, you're just at the end of that supply chain, right? You've got powders coming in, and you mix some slurries and you coat electrode and then you assemble cells, right? That's just the end of the battery business. Ahead of that is a huge industry where the graphite for conventional cells is being mined from a few locations, and then it's being processed. And there's some very heavy carbon-intensive, high-energy processing techniques and some very interesting leaching and other things that happen to make that graphite from a natural form into something you throw into batteries. On the cathode side, the NCA, even if you're doing LFP, you've got also huge processing steps that are happening upstream. Same way with separators, same way with even cell cans, right? You got nickel-coated steel, right? That's produced, and then someone turns it into a can for you. All that stuff shows up at your battery factory, and then you produce. And you also have all the tool makers who make all these tools because the automation is intense. You'll spend you know, probably, well, if we take the example of like the Reno Gigafactory, you know, Tesla spent probably $2 billion putting the shell together, and Panasonic put $4 billion of equipment into that factory to make cells, right? That's about 35 gigawatt hours. So, you know, you have all this industry upstream of the final cell factory. So what does it mean to do like lithium sulfur? So first off, it says, okay, you've shifted your supply chain. You're not buying NMC or LFP. You're not buying natural graphite. You're going to produce carbon in a different way. We think we can do it in a decarbonizing method, okay, which is huge. That'd be a huge technology in the US to do that. So you're going to produce carbon. You want to produce a lot of lithium. Lithium is obtainable from the subsurface, okay? The reality is, if we can do lithium sulfur in the US, the US could also become the dominant lithium supplier for the world, which I think a lot of people don't realize. They're like, oh, you know, all these minerals. The US has an amazing understanding of its subsurface, and it's got an amazing petroleum industry who knows how to get material out of that subsurface, and a refining industry that knows how to refine materials, right? So when people talk about DLE, there's some startups doing this, and you look at it and you go, wow, you know, if some of the big refining companies actually took a look at this, the US could be dominating the world in lithium production, which, you know, I'm kind of wondering why we haven't yet. But, you know, that could be a big, you know, big trade. Producing lithium metal itself, really old school technology that uses down cells that were like patented in the 1920s, I think. Like, it's a very old school technology. It's been moved to China, and India now is using a lot of this too to produce sodium. Bringing that back to the US could be kind of cool, right? But even if you did this internationally, you know, it's another economic area. And then, you know, sulfur's already produced, and it's in a useful form as it is. You know, you bring that together, you've changed not only the battery industry, the cell making, which employs thousands of people, okay, but you've got all the upstream work too, which you've shifted, and you have the potential to shift into the US, and you don't have to compete with the existing big suppliers, okay? Maybe you do compete on some things, but on other things, the field is open, right? Which means that, you know, there's space there for people to innovate into that and work into that. And then what does it mean downstream? Okay, you know, the US automakers, they're in a bad place right now. You know, they're talking about doing more ICE engine cars. They're having real trouble competing with EVs from around the world. And part of that is, you know, the Chinese make LFP super cheap, okay? And they make cells, and the best prices for those cells are going to the Chinese automakers. Right now, if the US automaker wants to make an EV, they're buying their cells from China, and they're taking whatever price the Chinese give them. And the Chinese have decided the Chinese want an auto industry. So they're not exactly ready to jump in and support the US auto industry, right? So the US auto industry is looking at, okay, I either am buying my EVs, my batteries from a country that is trying directly to compete with me, or I'm going to stick with ICE engines because I then have to, you know, buy that stuff from China, right? So we make lithium sulfur a real thing. That means the US auto industry can buy domestically batteries that are cheaper and have good long range. That lets them compete with the Chinese and with the auto industry. And, you know, it's the same thing too. If you want to design stationary battery systems in the US, okay, I was at the Tokyo Battery Show last week. There was half of an exhibit floor with stationary systems, like from Chinese, Korean, Japanese people making stationary battery packs, because it's going to be big business. It's going to be a huge business. You want to do that in the US, you better have domestic cell making here. Otherwise, those companies, you know, they're not going to get the best cell prices from these other nations, right? If they want to buy cells, they're going to need to buy them domestically. So that's where, you know, the economic progress for the country, you know, a lot of it's pretty much hinges on our auto industry and, you know, some new industries. If we're not, you know, if we can't make our own cells, we're not going to be competitive. We are going to be out of the business.
Concerning stuff, but
Yeah.
Interesting to hear. And just to summarize, I think, you know, one of the interesting things of this technology that you're saying is you really just need lithium, which we can extract here, like oil and gas in Arkansas and California from geothermal, and sulfur, which is a waste product.
Yeah,
That's a
we have
simple
lots.
supply chain.
It's really easy.
Um,
I wish everything was that easy about this chemistry, but that part's the easy
That's
part.
the easy part. Obviously,
Yeah.
like the graphene stuff we won't get into. But the Lev, I want to turn to you also on the subject of subsurface. Geothermal is front and center these days. It's definitely having a moment. The IEA finally put out a big report outlining the really enormous, unlimited potential of next-gen geothermal technologies. And I think we're hearing some pretty strong sentiments from this energy secretary as well. I want to hear your perspective as what would you see in the long term, the benefits of scaling this technology, and how does the existing know-how in oil and gas play into that? With that in mind, what's your strategy here to develop? You talked about Meta has a first project for you, a new stationary storage facility on a brownfield site. What does this look like for you in the long term?
Milo put 20 questions in
I'm
one
sorry, I was
sentence.
scared. We can cut it back. How about the
Right. Right.
oil and gas part?
So as far as benefits, on whatever side you are, it's either baseload green energy behind the fence, which doesn't require any fuel supply, or behind the meter, okay, which also very beneficial to current thinking of data centers where grid is not coming to you at the moment, okay? As far as oil and gas, as a person who spent 30 years in oil and gas, industry is amazing, okay? And it's not about only drilling, right? Because it's also processing, it's also control, it has absolutely fantastic engineering capability. But one thing that is relevant to geothermal that distinguish from everything else, oil industry knows how to move fast and deploy anywhere in the world, okay? From Arctic to jungles, okay? You think about deep water oil and gas production was developed in 10 years. You cannot, in 90s, you can, if you imagine what we had to do to achieve it, unconventional oil and gas was developed in US in 10 years, not by super majors, but independent. And if in 15 years, from being gross importer, we became to gross exporter, okay? So oil and gas has ability to take technology and move it globally with unbelievable speed. And that is actually bringing to my last question, what is our challenge or what is our strategy? The challenge is that oil and gas, we had infrastructure, how to bring R&D to scale up. Here, there is a huge gap between R&D and moving to scale, okay? And so that's the Death Valley, whatever terminology you want to use, we're trying to overcome from first of a kind that we already have built to offtake agreement with Meta that we need to move to be able to finance these projects.
Great. Thank you for the concise answer to my not concise question. Danielle, I want to come back to this idea of a high solar future. I think a lot of us are smelling that right now. Just the deployment, the hundreds of gigawatts thrown on the grid last year. In terms of this movement of technologies, we've seen PERC to TOPCon, and now this idea of perovskites that you mentioned. Can you elaborate more on what that outlook and that trajectory looks like, and how at Q-Cells you're thinking about approaching it?
Sure. So let me start just by grounding everyone on silicon. You know, it's our power workhorse of the solar industry. We know the good things about it are we know so much about silicon. We maybe know more about silicon than any other element because we've been working deeply in it with semiconductors and other technologies for so long. It's also very plentiful. It's practically sand, right? We know a lot about it. It's plentiful, And it also has a really good absorption spectrum that aligns with the visible spectrum, and we can use it to harness solar really well. The things that are not so great about it are, while the material is very plentiful, to be able to make solar cells out of it, you've got to use a lot of energy to essentially make these single crystal boules that you would then slice into wafers and use further. So it's a very high energy intensive solution to our challenge for energy. And it also has a limit on how much energy you actually can convert. It's 29% theoretical limit for a single junction silicon device. So if you think about what's the next stage, some would say, and I was actually a really big fan of thin film, and today we have cadmium telluride thin film in the market. Thin film is great because it's 1/100th of the thickness from a materials perspective. You use a lot less. It's also typically very plentiful, even easier to manufacture, even lower cost, but also lower efficiency, at least in the case of cadmium telluride. What would make thin film really great is if you could take two thin films and have them both capture different portions of the spectrum and put them together, then you've got two cheap things that add up to a much better efficiency than you would have with silicon today. So perovskite, this is why perovskite is garnering a lot more attention and interest around the world, because it, unlike cadmium telluride, it's a metal halide, so it has 3 different elements at least. And so you can engineer the band gap of that material in a way that you could actually make triple or double, 2 or 3 junctions or more. Probably no more than 3 would be feasible though, to capture different portions of the spectrum. So you could theoretically have up to 44% conversion efficiency. So that's quite a big opportunity, especially for a cheaper, easier, lower efficient or lower energy intensive mandate. So if the future is solar, we are definitely going to be pushing towards cheaper, faster, easier, less energy intensive. So I think that's kind of the basics. The challenge is perovskite is relatively immature. It has some reliability concerns because it's not just a pure inorganic material. Most of these are metal halides that have inorganic content. And so the idea is, how fast can you really develop something like that and supplant silicon, which is dominant? Or do you have to take a big step back to do that? So our strategy is not to, and there are many companies who are taking a different path. They're saying, we're going to go perovskite from the start, single junction, then we'll go to triple junction later if we need to. What we're saying is there's a whole industry based on solar panels, the way they look, the way they fit into a system. A solar panel is anywhere between 12 and 22% of the cost of a system. So we're not going to try to change the whole system. We're going to keep everything as much the same as possible at the modular level. And we'll start even with where we are today on crystalline silicon, and let's just put the thin film layer on top of what we already have. So now this dual junction, this tandem device, can have a theoretical efficiency of over 40%. We've actually demonstrated over 30% at pretty conventional commercial scale already in terms of cells. But the challenge is reliability. So that's what we and many others are working on. Although I just said earlier, I'm feeling much more confident in the last 6 months. But that is the promise, is our strategy is not to try to take a huge leap into the next domain, because even all these improvements you mentioned in silicon, they're all still silicon. So we're saying, let's build on silicon, get our arms around perovskite, really understand it well and understand how to utilize it. And at some point in the future, we can abandon the silicon capability. And frankly, that would be the big leapfrog. But if we do not make this first step on silicon, my view is that it will take too long and we won't have the learning. Like manufacturing floors these days are our laboratories for learning. If that's happening somewhere else and then the perovskite innovation is unlocked, we're dependent on somewhere else because we didn't learn it. We didn't build the knowledge here. So that's part of our domestic sort of mission, is also to create environments where we can learn about the next step. So not only are we developing it, but then we've got workforce training in progress.
Awesome. Exciting stuff on all fronts. I want to conclude with foreign policy before we open to Q&A. This project was a project to look at U.S. foreign policy for clean energy supply chains. And all of your systems, of course, tie into our activities beyond borders and transnational industrial activities. Lev, I'm going to pick on you first. We've talked about this before. And I want to ask you this question, fully acknowledging that the U.S. is the best market for next-gen geothermal right now. We have the drill rigs, we have the expertise, the casings, the tubulars, you name it. But let's say EGS and AGS work out, and the US could start to export this technology abroad, some of which are beginning, I will say. There's projects in Kenya, Philippines, and Germany right now taking off for this new technology. What would be some opportune markets that you would be thinking about? What are some good indicators?
Sure. So being based in Houston, you never think about district heating, right? That's not what we do in Houston. But then when I started to travel to Europe, I realized that when you talk about geothermal in Europe, they mean not what we mean here. Geothermal in Europe is what we use for district heating, okay? And so actually we found that the part of Department of Energy that promotes international collaboration is super active. So they approached us. We went with a big deal with Energy Secretary to Romania, and we signed offtake agreement with Elsan, which is a Romanian infrastructure company. And so we're going to be developing geothermal system, next generation geothermal system for Bucharest. We also went to Lithuania. In Lithuania, utility is a private business, and we found with Mr. Putin not supplying gas to them, and they're buying trash from Canada. They call it biofuel, and so they're burning trash. That's not a good source of energy for district heating. And in middle, northern, central Europe, all infrastructure have been built 100 years ago for centralized district heating. It's unreasonable to move it to something else. You cannot imagine how to do it. And because it's 100-year-old infrastructure, it's not very flexible. And geothermal provides amazing opportunity to get heat into this system. And by the way, heat in Europe 4 to 5 times more expensive than electricity, which I didn't know. It's just good business, okay? So it has geopolitical component, but it's also very good business. The second is what I'm passionate about. So you heard in the morning about like Pakistan quickly building solar, okay? Well, solar is up, whatever, 6-8 hours, depending where you are, and how to cover additional 16 or 18 hours. It means solar needs storage, and with our geopressurized storage, you can combine it with a solar on a scale from, let's say, 2 megawatt to 10 megawatts and make it really cheap. We did feasibility study with ADNOC, which is Abu Dhabi oil and gas company, and we can do blended power generation 24/7 at around 5 to 6 cents, okay? Which is at a scale of 2 to 10 megawatts. Think about remote village or small town. It's 1 megawatt for like 2,000 households. You cannot beat it today. And it doesn't need any external supply of fuel or anything. So that's opportunity that we're working on.
Fantastic. And congratulations. I didn't know that about Eastern Europe. Very exciting. Danielle, I want to turn to you. Bentley mentioned it during his presentation that the U.S. cannot go at this alone. It's going to need partners and allies, not just for resources, but also for intellectual property. Q-Cells is part of a Korean conglomerate known as Hanwha Group. Can you talk us through your experience of this venture in Georgia with a Korean-owned company, what that's been like, and are there any important lessons we could learn in this work from that?
Yeah, so the context for that is really important, I think. Q-Cells was started in 1999 in Germany, and it was bought by Hanwha Group in 2012, right around the time that most of the global solar companies were going out of business because there was a glut in the market of low-cost Chinese modules. I actually was working in the solar space, and I remember thinking, I admired Q-cells. They were the first company to get to a gigawatt. They were one of the biggest companies at the time. And at the time when Hanwha Group bought them, their vice chairman mentioned to me later that he thought it will certainly lose money for at least 3 or 4 years, but it was worth it because the long-term viability of solar was undeniable. It was more than 10 or 11 years before Q-cells became profitable again, in part because of the consistent persistence of the Chinese low-cost offering. However, the driver for him in making that investment, and the reason why Hanwha Group wanted to have a solar play, is because they learned an interesting lesson working in one of their other affiliates, which was a security business with closed caption TV, and they moved all of their capability out of China at a time when everything was moving into China, and within a few years, they were the only company that really had the ability to offer security solutions to governments around the world, and most of the governments didn't want to have their security solutions coming out of China. So that was an important lesson. So now enter where we are with our solar business. Our senior leadership in Korea looks at the opportunity that US is creating by having one of the only countries that have strong trade barriers to keep out any kind of material issues like dumping from China, for example. And they also know it's a big market where they can have the downstream solution as well. So creating this very unique solution of this all under one roof supply chain was their pathway to creating a foothold and a sort of a differentiation in the US market. I will say, interestingly, their initial approach was quite different from a lot of the US players because they didn't get a lot of concessions in advance before they made these plans and started building this full supply chain. So only in the last month and a half has the recent modifications from Treasury around the domestic content turned out to make it okay. But there was some very tense times in the last year where we were nervous that we were investing in this capability that wasn't going to be quite valued in this country. But having it happen, the biggest challenges are workforce, construction. This has never been done before here. Building up our capabilities using local talent. I think the community loves the jobs we're bringing, but it's also confusing. And we have Korean expats that are still part of the community, and there's a language barrier and a time zone barrier, as there is with any foreign investment to build manufacturing. But I think it's a natural course of growth, so it's kind of an adventure as well.
Great. We're getting our Q&A flag, but I want to give Selena a last chance to just speak on the potential for foreign opportunities. Lighten's technology is being developed here. You have 2 facilities in pipeline in the United States.
Yeah.
What could this mean for other places, for other markets, for Europe, for example?
Yeah. So the thing about lithium sulfur is that it really can be manufactured pretty much on any continent with the local supply chain, right? You can find all these materials there. So this is an opportunity to really decouple cell making and battery storage from the geopolitics and really democratize it across the world, right? So that has huge implications for the EU. This is a chemistry that could be built in the EU for sure. Could also be built in China. It could be built, in India. It could be built in Africa, right? So this becomes, this becomes a technology for the world. Our cells are also just a touch easier to make than the conventional lithium ion. There's some, vagaries of the sulfur chemistry that make it just a little easier, a little bit less hair-raising an exercise to kind of spread this cell making out. And, that really opens up, it opens up jobs everywhere, right? It opens up jobs everywhere. It opens up economic opportunity everywhere. So that's a huge thing. I will say, though, we need this in the U.S. too. We can't keep sending our manufacturing jobs overseas because really, if you want to create prosperity in an area, in a country, you have to have the manufacturing jobs as the basis. That the impact of actually doing this stuff locally is beyond anything most people realize.
Great points, and I know Kate spoke about that at length. And I want to open it up to guests from our conference guests before. We have a bunch from the internet. I see a hand over here. Yes.
Hi, Jonas Goldman, Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab. I did some of the research for the task force. I got a question for Danielle. Actually, you were talking about, the start line is solar and then perovskite for the next leap, and then that leap afterwards is replacing the silicon component with thin film. I'm just wondering if Q-Cells has given a thought to the challenges that's emerged so far with merging thin film with perovskites, right? Like the two don't really play well together right now in the lab. You can get up to like 25% efficiency, while the silicon and perovskite can get up to 40% efficiency. So obviously don't reveal any trade secrets here, but is there sort of like a greater R&D play there? Are you guys just trying to out-science the problem and like eventually figure out to make the chemistry work? Or what's the sort of idea there? Because there seems to be a significant stopgap right now.
And just to jump in real quick, I think that's particular to CAD-TEL, that dynamic. And
I'll just make one thing clear. Perovskite is thin film.
Yeah.
So CAD-TEL is also thin film. And when I talk about a multi-junction thin film, it would be perovskite on perovskite. They would just be two different perovskite compositions, potentially, that could be tuned with different band gaps to capture different portions of the spectrum. Similar to how CAD-TEL and perovskite, although I don't know that they would be as good of a match, or silicon and perovskite. So the idea would just be to move away from the silicon backbone and only onto thin film, but compatible thin films. And I think you're right, there have been some challenges in merging some types of thin films with others. Yeah, right, but our vision is to go to pure perovskite-based thin film.
Wow. Aislinn, do the honors. Too many people I respect to choose from, equally respect.
All right. Thank you. This was really interesting. I want to ask you what role you think like federal policy could and should play to support next generation technology development, especially if your companies are working in other countries that do things. And I offer that by way of reflecting on when I started in the Biden administration, the Department of Energy was an R&D agency. It did not do a good job at commercialization. It didn't do a good job of first of a kind or second of a kind demonstration, like you're talking about on advanced geothermal. And a lot of new capabilities were built up in that agency in the Biden administration. You're seeing massive cuts by DOGE and to all the new people at these agencies who have really advanced skills on finance and bringing in private capital into an industry. But we thought that it was really helpful to build new capabilities to go from R&D through first of a kind, second of a kind, and commercialization. But I would love to hear from the private sector perspective, like where do you wish there was greater policy support, recognizing that you understand the geopolitical rationale for your investments. What other things would you like to see from federal policy?
Oh, so many things. So probably the biggest driver has been the IRA, the tax credit for cells, for batteries, the $35 per kilowatt hour, and then some additional on other things. The money that we're talking about, this is huge money, right? I told you, like Tesla's, Panasonic's Gigafactory, $6 billion, right? I think the IRA spread batteries, they had $3 billion to spread around the entire battery sector. It was like that super thin layer of peanut butter. And no one felt really, it's just not enough money, right? So, and if we look at, trying to bring these factories to life, the price tags go in the billions, okay? How the U.S. government's going to figure that out is real tough. And, we'll say, okay, look, we could raise the money if the U.S. government gave us a demand signal. Unfortunately, the U.S. government's kind of bad about deciding to give us a demand signal, right? So, we can say, well, let's have the military buy new technology cells, right? That's good for national security, right? So we've been trying to get that to happen. And the military says, well, we don't actually buy cells. A lot of our subcontractors and our other people buy cells. And, go, okay, well, can you mandate that they're going to buy the new technology? And no one wants to do that, okay? There's language that we tried to put into some of the appropriations bills that said, you're going to buy cells from some fraction of U.S. suppliers and new technologies. And it got watered down to say, well, we'll think about buying technology from new suppliers, right? So when we're going out to the capital markets and saying, okay, guys, fund us to build these giant factories, and they're going, well, where's your demand signal coming from? And, the US government's not providing that demand signal. And, the best thing the US government could do would be provide robust demand signal that we can go out to the capital markets, get the money, short of, giving us the money. But I know that's not realistic, right?
What she said, yeah.
Yeah.
I would say demand signal and long-term demand signal.
Long-term demand signal, yeah, that's huge. Yeah.
Great. We're a little short on time. Would love to try and get a couple questions in. Abigail, I know you had a hand up. Okay. Tim and Herbert in the back.
Hello, Rob Sweeney, Excelix Partners. So I'm just wondering, what is the timeline? What do you think the development timeline is? What does that look like for perovskite to start with? And
Yes.
then, Lev, do you agree that solar is the future or not?
And I should be clear before Lev answers. Solar is a big part of the future. There's no one solution that is the only part of our future. And I think we mostly all agree with that. But in terms of timeline, I won't tell you our timeline specifically, but I will tell you the timeline for us and our competitors who all have commercial ambition range from 2 years from now, which has always been 2 years from now, even 10 years ago, to 3 to 5 years from now. So it's in the early 2030s at the latest, or it probably can't be done effectively.
So I don't believe that geothermal is in competition with solar at all. You can make a case that long-term geothermal is in competition with SMRs, okay? One thing I can tell you that there is a well-known curve, and I cannot give you from top of my head reference of long duration energy storage as a function of solar penetration. Pretty much after 40%, there is an exponential growth of long duration energy storage, and this is our bread and butter. So the quicker Daniel delivers, the better for our business.
And there's, one exciting thing about the new geothermal technologies is that they are flexible, right? The old ones, not so much. These can ramp up and down when Danielle's sun sets.
Right.
Lev can bring up power.
Yeah.
Last question, please.
Thanks, Milo. Herbert Crowther at the Eurasia Group. One more question for Danielle. Following up on what you said earlier about some of the local challenges, very curious if you have any additional reflections on how you've seen some of the local suppliers, local supportive supply chain mature over the last year or two, and whether you have any expectations, reflections for where that may go over the next year or two.
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of our supply chain that has been built up near our factories in Atlanta is other Hanwha Group affiliates. So Hanwha has an advanced materials group who's making our encapsulants right across the street from our solar business. But then there's also glass companies. We don't do glass, so there's glass manufacturing being set up. And I would say the biggest driver for success in that community of supply chain to our factory is the state level support. Not just funding, but finding land. They're even helping us look for some land for project area and R&D space, being very aggressive about pursuing us to make it easy for us to want to choose that location. And that's really helped us build out our supply chain in the region as well. Not that those groups don't also get federal support and they don't also bring foreign investment, but I would say maybe the unsung hero here is the state.
Fantastic. I want to give a round of applause to our guests for joining us. We're going to have some final remarks from our director. Thank you, guys.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to close out what's been an incredibly rich and thought-provoking conversation during the day. Let me first thank the members of the task force. You have been not only actively involved, you have been open-minded, and you have engaged in an incredibly rare activity in Washington, which is truly open bipartisan debate, really substantive, really detailed, and that has been a real asset to all of us. Let me also thank the team behind the scenes that worked, as well as in the front of the cover of the papers. Of course, Milo, Bentley, Noah, but also Dan Helmessy, Jonas Goldman, Deborah Go, Devin Mangalmurthy, and Aislinn Familietti, who has been essential to make all of this happen. I think in closing, I'd say that the task force is asking us to make a tough and complicated argument, but nevertheless a really urgent argument. And that argument to this administration is that regardless of your views about climate change, regardless of your position on domestic climate action, you should care about competing and eventually winning the global race for clean energy, right? And that might seem like a challenging argument to make right now, but I think the Commission, the task force, has given very powerful arguments as to why you should pursue that anyway, right? And there's something here for everyone. If you care about rebuilding America's manufacturing base, if you care about generating jobs all over the United States, if you care about a military that is able to deploy its capabilities without having to lug around tons of expensive fossil fuels, right? If you care about, of course, emissions, if you care about technological supremacy, then you ought to care about winning the race for clean energy. That argument, by the way, that narrative is not out there yet. It is here. The task force has built it and given us all of the key components to build that narrative, but now it has to be told. That narrative has to get out there, and it is not currently, not even the dominant narrative, certainly, but it is not yet fully well known, not just among policymakers, but also among some of the key business leaders and among the key stakeholders that are going to shape policy over the next 4 years. We need the task force has also been clear that this is urgent. That's why the paper is called How Not to Lose the Race. It's not called How to Win It, because we are currently in such a place that not losing is the first step, and that is very urgent. By the way, this conversation we had here this morning is likely also occurring in Jakarta, in South Africa, in London, certainly, in Brussels, in many capitals around the world. Everybody is trying to hedge because they look at the future and they see a risky world. Everybody's trying to figure out how to secure their supply chains, how to onshore lots of ideas and lots of capacities. And so we have to remember that we simply are not going to impose our view or our vision as compelling as it might be on others, because everybody is trying to hedge. And we have to bring that, we have to keep that in mind as we make offers to other countries. The task force, I think, was also pretty clear that you need a number of ingredients to make this recipe work. You need finance. And having worked in the Biden administration, I can tell you that finance was always a problem. The finance never really matched the loftiness of the discourse. And there were, yes, lots, as the papers clearly demonstrate, there were lots of diplomatic entreaties, lots of diplomacy, lots of trips, but the finance was always a difficult challenge. And that cannot happen, right? There are opportunities, as we have discussed here, for reauthorization of the Development Finance Corporation, the Export-Import Bank. There's a proposal, as you know, for a U.S. sovereign wealth fund. There's real possibility here for institutions that have the resources and can deploy financial instruments that are highly flexible and suited to the task. We need people. We need qualified people in the Department of Energy who understand the sectors. We need people who will do the deals in the DFC and EXIM. We need people in the, of course, the private sector that can bring some of these technologies to the attention of the world. We need people in our embassies and USTDA who can help identify the opportunities on the ground around the world. And that challenge is essential, and we have to invest now. The task force is also clear. We need, and it came up today several times, we need policy coherence. We can't be pushing the brakes and the accelerator at the same time. And I know that the US government, just because of the way we are constituted, we're not very good at coherence. But we're going to have to get very good at different alignment of international development policy, of energy policy, of foreign policy, of security policy, if we are going to make this race something viable. And as Samira mentioned, things will move at the speed of trust. And trust is an asset that is currently in short supply. We're going to have to build it over time, not just through conversations about clean energy, but more broadly about foreign policy. So the task force has given us what we need. The question now is how to build the political capital to put in place these various ingredients. And that's going to require, as I said, really spreading the word, making sure this narrative that we must pursue this clean energy competition is a priority and should be a priority. I think there are, our estimation is that there are many pragmatic decision makers in the current administration and on Capitol Hill, certainly in the business community, that there are folks who see how this agenda is actually highly consistent with many of the goals that have been expressed by the president and by many other decision makers. And so the question now is, how do we connect those dots and make it compelling? Breaking through the noise will be difficult, but I think all of us have a responsibility to try. Finally, what's next? For us here at Carnegie, we first want to encourage you to read and to delve into the 15 other papers and materials that underpin what you heard here today. You may not want to read all of them, but some of them are very interesting, I think, for you, especially on, I would recommend the batteries paper is excellent. Foreign policy pieces that were discussed here, very rich, very empirically grounded, very deep studies, which is a real asset for, I think, all of us. Next, what we're going to do is think about the framework that folks here have laid out. We've talked a lot here about onshoring, reshoring, and leapfrogging. And making the decision as to which one of those three you pick is not a simple thing. We spent lots of years, this administration, the past administration, and the one before, trying to figure out which one of the three, how do you turn those three options into a viable strategy? And I think the scholars here have put together a framework that actually gives us a way to think rationally about how to do that, technology by technology, country by country. So we would like to continue to refine that framework and provide policymakers with something that they can actually use, something they can actually bring to interagency meetings and lay out compelling arguments for how to pursue these three options. We want to do a deep dive on geothermal. We agree that it is extremely underutilized, extremely important, and could really provide us with long-term firm energy. And we want to be very much a part, as many of you do as well, to be part of the conversation on the financial institutions. I mentioned EXIM, DFC, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and many others, which are still going to be essential for this. I would include the multilateral development banks, of course, where we are quite important. And finally, I think it's going to be essential for us to keep telling the story, not just in Washington, inside the Beltway, but across the country, especially where many of the jobs will be created, many of the opportunities will arise, and start talking to our partners, because they will see this eventually as also in their long best interest. So I think the task force has done an amazing job here in giving us what we need. Now we have to build not just the details and the policy implementation, but also a sustainable political narrative that can really help us capture the attention of decision makers at a very difficult and turbulent time. So thank you again, and thank you all for coming.